JSX. Hey everybody, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget, let's take an in-depth look at the syntax for writing our user interface code inside of JavaScript. It's called JSX. There's this movie that came out a few years ago called Galaxy Quest, and it's sort of making fun of silly science fiction TV shows. And there's this great sequence in it where Sigourney Weaver's character realizes that she was only included on the TV show because of her looks, and that her fictional character's job on the show was really ridiculous. She basically repeated back whatever the captain said to the ship's computer, and it was totally meaningless. She didn't have any job. She's starting to get self-conscious about this as she realizes it. And during a dramatic turn during Galaxy Quest the movie, she sort of slips back into that role and she starts performing that job again, just repeating back what the captain says to the computer. And somebody else in the room says, you don't have to do that. The computer can hear the captain just fine. And she spins around and snaps at this person and she says, look, I've got one job on this lousy ship, and it's stupid, but I'm going to do it. And that line always makes me laugh because I think it's really well delivered. But I'm reminded of it a lot when I'm working with these various JavaScript engines that are all the rage for web development right now, because I feel like we're taking the one thing that HTML does, lays out our content and our presentation, and we're pulling it into JavaScript. I mean, come on, guys. Poor HTML. It's got one job. Let it do it. Well, in this case, we do let it do it. JSX, which we've been working with a lot in these nuggets on React, is a really simple and easy way to bring effectively HTML into our JavaScript. JSX is an XML-styled syntax for use inside of JavaScript, and it takes the best parts of HTML. It takes that one job that HTML does, and it allows it to keep doing it, but this time inside of our JavaScript code. At a very high level, JSX allows us to take some sort of confusing and ugly JavaScript code like this and turn it into a nice, clean, terse layout like this, right inside of our JavaScript. This has enormous advantages for us. It allows us to build testable, unit-testable modules for our content, for our HTML inside of our JavaScript. So we're no longer reliant on simply seeing the output, but we can actually proactively test our HTML code. It also, of course, as you've seen with elements and components, allows us to integrate various properties and states and events with our backend very simply right inside of the HTML, or in this case the XML itself. So here I am passing in properties right there inside of the XML with some slightly different syntax. This means that we get nice, clean, easy to read code inside of our JavaScript that's still ultimately going to evaluate into JavaScript. This is a really important thing to know, is that this JSX right here ultimately gets turned back into this code, always. That's just what it does. The JSX interpreter pre-processes our JSX code before React does anything else. So this is the actual React code over here that's getting sent into our React library, but our JSX is simply getting pre-processed first. It's a nice, quick, and easy step. You don't have to use it, right? That should be the sort of takeaway there. Either one of these code examples that I have on screen are perfectly acceptable. I think you should be using it. I think it's much, much easier to use, although it can be helpful to take a look at the React.js code on the left here and sort of understand what's going on with that. Now, before we take a look at a couple of examples and just see how it works a little bit, I want to talk about some things that you absolutely need to know when you're talking about JSX. First of all, it is not HTML, it's XML. This is really, really important. It looks a lot like HTML, but it absolutely is not. And you can see that with, well, up here you can see the curly braces, like around some data. We have curly braces. Those are not HTML. And you've got things like dashboard and my element. Those are not HTML tags. So it's XML code. It's not HTML. JSX, because it's inside of JavaScript, has to avoid keywords like class. So when you actually want to set up a class on an element, you have to use class name instead. You can see an example of that right here. CLASS capital NAME. That will ultimately get compiled down into a class, a CSS class for that element, but it's class name inside of JSX. When you want to tell JSX about an HTML tag, you use lowercase for HTML tags. So this is getting a little crowded up here, but you can see div and h1 there. Those are all lowercase. Those are real HTML tags, but when you're talking about your React components, your custom components, you're going to use capital case. That means capital first letter, and then theoretically every word after that should be capitalized, but at the very least the first letter has to be capitalized. So my element and dashboard up there have a capital first letter. JSX knows those are custom. React components, it's going to look for elements over here, or components over here that have been created to represent those. And then last thing, this is sort of important to know, is that you should be using camel case for HTML attributes. So just like class name there is a lowercase c but then a capital N, All HTML attributes should have camel case. You see that a lot in the event system. It's always little o, little n, and then say big C for click. On click would be little o, little n, then big C. And lastly, we'll take a look at this as well because this is important. Style is a JSON object. So style is no longer a string, it's now a JSON object, and we'll take a look at how that works. To see all this in action, I'm going to show you two really cool tools that are available out there on the web, the Babel.js REPL, and this one, the HTML to JSX converter. So this will take our JSX, I got it right, and it will show the JavaScript React output from that JSX. We can key in whatever JSX we want, and it's going to show us the output from it. That's really, really cool. This one does the reverse. This will take our HTML and show us the JSX equivalent of that HTML. So if you have, say, a big chunk of HTML that you're ready to move into React and you need to get the JSX from it, you can just cut and paste it right into this little tool and get your JSX out. That's kind of a neat, handy way to do. It's also a good learning tool. You can understand how these different things compile and convert from JSX to HTML and back. For example, here's that code I just had on screen, although now I've got it plugged right into the Babel tool. And you can see how each element or each item over here on the left turns into JavaScript. So right over here is a div with a class name and some div text, and you can see that turns into this item right here. So it's react.createElement. What is the element? It's div. What are its attributes? Well, class name is red, and then its value is some div text here. That's how we create an element. If we have a custom element, my element, you can see it's basically the same thing, except instead of div being passed in as a string, it passes in a my element object. Now, my element is not defined, but that's a problem for a different point. This is how this particular piece of code gets compiled or gets transpiled, as they call it, into JavaScript. Below that, I've got a simple JavaScript object defined right inside of my code, and you can see that that doesn't actually change at all because JavaScript is JavaScript. Doesn't have to do anything to that. So it's able to skip over and ignore typical JavaScript, but look and find things like this dashboard element right here, which gets turned into this create element. And notice here inside of this dashboard that I've got a child element inside of that. So I've got my dashboard element, and then I've got a dash element down here. And you can see how, actually it's got an h1 and then a dash element. So you can see how I've got my create element, and then the third property of that create element is another create element. Actually two create elements, one for the h1 and one for the dash element. So it's able to really easily and quickly combine to build my JavaScript, my React.js code from the JSX, but it's significantly shorter. It's 13 lines of code here versus 25 over here. It's significantly, in my opinion, easier to read than the JavaScript code on the right. So I think it really takes advantage of the one job that HTML does really well, and it allows HTML to do that job. It does it right inside of our JavaScript. Again, this tool is really cool. If I update this as I go, I can just add a heading 2 element here. It updates in live on the right hand side, so I can always see my changes and what they're going to look like inside of React.js. Now the other tool that I talked about, I think you'll find is a much more helpful and useful tool for day-to-day development. This is going to convert your HTML to JSX. So typically JSX looks like HTML, but it's not exactly the same. And for instance, when you bring it up, it shows you this this little hello world item here with a div and a class. Notice the style equals border 1 pixel solid red. And I mentioned that style in JSX is a JSON object, not a string. You can see that over here on the right-hand side. Style is passed in as, well, a border value with a string, or a border key with a string value. Let me expand this out so we can see how this works a little bit. We'll say border is that, and I'll give it a font family as Arial. Check out what's happened over here on the right-hand side. My object now has two items in it, the border being set to 1 pixel solid red, and font family, camel case, notice, no dash in it because this is JavaScript, is set to equal the string Arial. This whole thing is encased inside of curly braces because it is a JavaScript object, and then those curly braces are inside of additional curly braces because it is escaped. It's JavaScript code that's escaped inside of our JSX. Remember, to put JavaScript in the middle of our JSX, we need to escape it with the curly braces. You could actually see that over here on this page when you look at prop A equals 20. I don't just set it equal to the number 20. That would give me an error. if I take out these curly braces right here, I can even see it down here. It says, hey, there's a problem with prop A equaling 20 because JSX should either be an expression or quoted JSX text. So I got to turn it into expression by escaping it with those curly braces, and now it works. Well, same thing over here on this particular page. We need to be able to escape our JavaScript object with the first curly brace, and then the second curly brace actually defines the JavaScript object itself. So if it looks a little weird with the double curly braces, that's why. So that concludes this nugget on JSX. To recap, JSX is optional but highly recommended XML code that you can use directly inside of JavaScript. It makes your JavaScript a little bit easier to read when it comes to declaring and defining user interface elements. It basically takes the best part of HTML and moves it into your JavaScript so that you can build your user interface with React.js. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.